In terms of Kurt Cobain's death, Mark Lanigan has said he has deep regrets because apparently he didn't pick up Kurt's calls the day he died. I'm going to be sharing with you the history of what happened there momentarily. Now, Mark Lanigan was close not just with Kurt Cobain, but he was also very tight with Lane Staley. Later in this video, I'm going to share with you a few quotes from both Mark and Duff McKagan where they discuss the death of Lane Staley, but first, let's go back to Mark and Kurt Cobain. For those of you, by the way, who may not be familiar with Mark Lanigan, he was the lead singer of the Screaming Trees. They never got as big as Nirvana or Alice in Chains, but they were still a very important grunge band. Now, in an interview for Rolling Stone, journalist Corey Groh asked Mark Lanigan the following question, quote, "You wrote that you have a deep regret for your actions around his death because he'd called you that day and you didn't return his calls. How did you process his death?" The following is Mark Lanigan's response. This article for Rolling Stone was published on April 23, 2020. Quote, "When a drug addict loses a friend, they just do more drugs. I moved forward by sticking with the people that I knew, Dylan Carlson and my best friend in Seattle, Lane Staley, and we continued to do what we always did. But now we were missing a huge piece of our lives. Logic would tell you that when a friend of yours dies the way that Cobain did, it would make you wise up and say, oh crap, man, do I want to end up like this too? But instead, what a drug addict does is they just do more drugs and cry in their beer. Kurt's death just made me go deeper and deeper, just wanting to disappear and forget that I had what started as this really pure relationship of mutual admiration with Kurt for each other's music, which we had for years. We liked the same kind of music, and then that warped into a situation where he had become so famous that he said to me at one point, "You and Dylan are the only real friends I have anymore," at the height of his popularity, and it was really just sad. I also remember thinking, what kind of friend am I? Because this guy used to look up to me, and he always acted as though he did look up to me still, even though I knew he saw my decline. I just remember thinking, wow, I could have shown some decent guidance here to help this kid who looked up to me and who I loved. And instead, I was just a guy who became one of those people that would go out and buy drugs for his more famous friends who couldn't go out in public. That was hard to reconcile, and it always will be. I could have been a different person, but I wasn't. Kurt and I were really close before he became famous. Funny enough, I was actually the famous one in our relationship for a number of years. He had a natural talent. I knew that from the moment I saw him singing in the Ellensburg Public Library, in a tiny town I grew up in. Dylan Carlson had asked me to go see his friend Kurt's band play there because Kurt was a fan of mine. And that's how I met Kurt, as a fan of mine. He looked up to me sort of like a big brother, but I knew this guy had something magical. It took a while, but obviously, the world recognized his talent at some point, and we all know what happened with that. End quote. Mark Lanigan and Nirvana have shared history with one another, particularly the Jury Project in 1989, where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickerel of the Screaming Trees recorded 4 songs together with Kurt and Chris, most notably a rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which was released on Mark Lanigan's debut solo record in 1990, The Winding Sheet. The jury sessions took place in August of 1989. A few months earlier, on April 14, 1989, Nirvana played a show in Mark Lanigan's hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, a small city about 2 hours southeast of Seattle. The show made a big impression on Mark Lanigan, who once recalled the following, quote, "In the spring of '89, Nirvana played a show at the community center in my hometown of Ellensburg, Washington. They completely blew me away. It was like seeing The Who in their prime. After 2 songs, some guy who worked there stopped the show. Nirvana had gone over their time limit because the local bands who had opened had gone over time. So they just stood there for a second, and then Chris started throwing his bass in the air, up to the top of this 20-foot ceiling and catching it with one hand. Meanwhile, Kurt was letting his amp go as loud as heck, and their road manager got into a fist fight with the guy who stopped the show. The whole thing was completely crazed. And this was in Ellensburg of all places. I still believe to this day, Nirvana's the best band I've ever seen." End quote. Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain are of course 2 of the marquee figures of the grunge scene, and according to Mark Pickerel, the 2 of them had a mutual respect for one another. The following is a quote from Mark Pickerel. Quote, I know that Kurt was a big fan of Lanigan's. They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums on a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of to be the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but be really the band leader. He is just a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Chris. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision." End quote. As mentioned earlier in the first Mark Lanigan quote that I read, according to Mark Lanigan himself, Mark's best friend was Lane Staley of Alice in Chains. The following is a quote where Mark Lanigan talks about the death of Lane Staley and how he compares Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain to one another, how their two deaths affected him differently. Quote, "Out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Lane Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, 'Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, 'No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago.' His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, 'I always just keep thinking I'm going to get that same feeling I got the first time again.' And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen. Although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Lane, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Lane was like a twin.
Demri Perot and Lane Staley. Mark Lanigan knew both of them well. As a matter of fact, Mark was Lane Staley's best friend during the good and the bad. I'm going to share with you a few quotes from Mark regarding Demri and Lane. Now keep in mind, as mentioned, Mark was literally Lane Staley's best friend, and he chose to willingly publish these quotes I'm going to share. Unfortunately, given the fact it is a tragic love story, the tragedy does take precedence in any honest retelling. Before she passed away, Demri's mother actually reached out to me and said she appreciated the balanced approach I took to Demri's story. So with all that said, who exactly was Mark Lanigan and what was his relationship to Demri and Lane? Mark and his band Screaming Trees never got as big as Alice in Chains, but they were still an important grunge band, and Mark in particular was very close with both Lane and Kurt Cobain. With regards to Demri, Mark had multiple things to say about her in his book Sing Backwards and Weep. If you want an unfiltered view about the dark side of the grunge movement, this is worth checking out. The first Demri-related quote I want to share with you is how apparently Demri wanted to hook up with Mark, even though she was dating Lane. It's well documented that, unfortunately, both Demri and Lane cheated on each other various times.
This exchange between Mark and Demri happened at some point in the late 80s. Quote,
"For years, Lane had a passionate on and off relationship with a girl named Demri, a friend of my ex-girlfriend Anna. Their relationship was marked with dizzying highs and dark, depressing lows. She was said to be somewhat indiscriminate when it came to hooking up with people, much like myself. Who knows, I thought before I really knew him, maybe it's an open relationship. But once Lane and I became friends, it became clear that Demri's behavior caused Lane some pain, even though they both cheated on each other. I had gotten a glimpse into her straightforward approach before I'd even met Lane. Ironically, in the same way that I met Lane, Demri and I encountered each other for the first time outside of a Seattle drug house. As I was leaving, she was going in. 'Hey there, aren't you Anna's boyfriend? I'm Demri.' I was instantly attracted to this sexy, smiling girl. The first thought that rolled through my head was, wow. She had this alluring outward sexuality, a beautiful face, and the most extraordinary eyes. 'Yeah, I am. Please don't tell her you saw me here, though. That would cause problems,' I said. I felt like such a jerk whenever I was compelled to ask a stranger to keep my secrets, but most addicts were keeping secrets from someone themselves. There was some semblance of a code of secrecy among certain junkies. 'No problem here, handsome. What are you doing right now?' she asked me with a coy smile. 'No plans, just heading home.' 'Well, why don't you come home with me? We can get high and have sex.' That came out of the blue. Demri's brazen, direct approach put me on heels for a second, but struck me like a kick to the balls. A shockingly pleasurable one. I don't think that would be a very good idea. Thanks, but I can't." Then she grabbed my hand and said, "Oh, come on, I'll never tell anyone. You're cute. I like you. Nobody's at my place. Come on, you won't be sorry." I was sorely tempted, but I had a feeling I would somehow end up very sorry. Your private business could spread quickly through the small, incestuous Seattle music scene. Demri was beautiful. It was the type of situation I found nearly impossible to pass up. But Demri's connection to my girlfriend and to this guy Lane that I'd not met yet but already deeply respected as an artist made me think twice. For once, I was smart enough not to take the bait. With more than a little regret, I again declined Demri and walked home alone. But for a while afterward, it continued to play heavily on my mind."
End quote. Now, heroin addiction, of course, was not uniquely a Lane and Demri issue. Seattle, in general, has had a heroin problem for a long time. At the end of this documentary, I'm going to share with you a few quotes from people who describe what the situation was like regarding heroin in the Seattle grunge scene in the 90s. But first, let's get back specifically to Lane and Demri. According to many people who knew Lane, including Mark Lanigan, Demri Perot's death in 1996 basically killed Lane Staley emotionally and sent him on an even bigger downward spiral than he was already on. According to Mark, when he first spoke to Lane over the phone about Demri's death, Lane was in shambles. Unfortunately, Mark was on tour in Europe with the Screaming Trees and couldn't be there in Seattle to comfort Lane. Quote,
"There was a knock on my hotel room door. I looked out the peephole and saw it was a friend on the other side. I unlocked the door and let him in. By the sad, beaten-down look on his face, I knew he had some bad news. 'Hey, Mark, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Demri passed away. Lane would like you to call him as soon as you can.' No, not again, I thought. This was going to destroy Lane. He had loved her so passionately that after their final breakup, one of many breakups in their tempestuous years-long on-again, off-again relationship, Lane had made a conscious decision to never date another woman. If not with Demri, he preferred to be alone. My heart was broken for him. I called him and left a message with my room number and the phone number to the hotel, and he called right back. The first thing he said to me was, 'Oh man, I can't believe it, she's gone.' Then he broke down in tears. I reacted, 'I'm so sorry, brother. I am so sorry. I don't know what to say. I'm just incredibly sorry this happened to you.' Even though I'd had plenty of experience with loss, I was still a piss-poor comfort to those in pain. I had never developed the necessary skills to verbally express any real words of wisdom to help anyone in that way. My first public response to death of a friend was stoicism. Privately, I might cry like a baby. Through his tears, Lane said, 'I can't stand to be alone right now. When are you coming back?' 'I just got here today, Lane. We're not back for 6 weeks.' 'Crap,' he said. 'I wish you were coming back sooner. I need to hang out with someone. This is tearing me up.' 'I'm sorry, bro. Look, my friend Simon is at my place. Go stay there. I need someone to keep an eye on him anyways. Kick him out of their bedroom and you take it. He can sleep on the couch or the mattress. You be doing me a favor, man. Lane had been around Simon, and I knew he could tolerate him. Simon's generally quiet nature made him easy to be around, and I trusted him. Okay, I'm going over there, Lane said quickly. Just let me know when I should call Simon and give him a heads up, I responded. Right now, Lane said. I quickly did the math. 2:30 in the afternoon in Paris meant it was 5:30 a.m. in Seattle. Demri's mother lived just a block from my apartment. I wondered if Lane might drop in there to offer his condolences or get a tiny sip of relief in sharing their shared pain of loss, even though they'd had a bit of a strained relationship. Upon returning to Seattle after my horrific tour of Europe, the first thing Lane said to me when he saw me was, "Whoa, man, what the hell happened to you?" "Let's just say it was a rough ride," I said, and left it at that. I was relieved to have reliable sources of heroin at my disposal once more, and the three of us stayed awake for days on end in my apartment, alternatively hitting the pipe with Simon obsessively scanning the floor looking for what we might have dropped. Eventually, Simon, like so many other addicts I've crossed paths with, went for a walk one day and simply never came back. Now it was just me and Lane. Lane spent a few more months in squalor with me in my small one-bedroom apartment. He never stopped grieving Demri's death. After a while, Lane's father, Phil, also an addict, took up Simon's dubious duties as our runner, which made for a weird dynamic. Finally, after almost 4 months, Lane began to crave isolation and moved back into his penthouse condo in the University District.
End quote. Demri's death absolutely devastated Lane. She was by far the most important romantic relationship he ever had. His infamous self-imposed lockdown in his apartment during the latter stages of his life when Demri had passed away is well documented. But even before Demri died in '96, Lane was experiencing several dark episodes in that apartment. I'm going to share with you a couple of quotes now, first from Mark Lanigan and then from Johnny Bacolis, an old friend of Lane's who lived with him in the apartment. These quotes describe what Lane was like around the time of Mad Season. Mad Season was the supergroup Lane was a part of from '94 to '96, so these quotes take place in that time period. The first quote is from Mark Lanigan's book Sing Backwards and Weep, where he discusses a very sad episode of Lane where he was experiencing hallucinations in his apartment. Quote, "When I was not developing songs with my band Screaming Trees, I continued making and selling crack. Whenever I was not working, I was spending most of my free time smoking crack and shooting heroin around the clock, with Lane Staley in his apartment. He had a roommate for a while, a really nice normal dude named Johnny, who I had at first suspected to be hired by someone to keep an eye on Lane. It became obvious after a while that Johnny was just a guy who cared for Lane, a friend and a non-drug user. Whenever we got loaded while he was at home, it was in the privacy of Lane's bedroom. Johnny seemed increasingly beat down by the futility and the darkness that began to pervade the place, less happy to see me and less lighthearted every time I'd stop by. Johnny moved out after 6 or 7 months. Unsupervised, the pair of us sank deeper into the crap. Lane called one night and frantically asked me to come over right away. When I got there, I did our secret personal sequence of knocks on the door and heard him shout from down the hall, "Come in!" That in itself shocked me because he would never leave the door unlocked. I came in, locked the door, and cautiously called his name. "Down here, man, in the bathroom." "Why was the door unlocked, bro?" I asked while approaching the toilet. "So I can get out of here in a hurry if I have to," Lane hissed. I entered the bathroom to the strange sight of him lying on his stomach on the floor, his head behind the bathroom toilet, staring intently at a tiny hole in the wall. "What's going on, brother? Why would you have to get out of here?" I quietly asked, not sure if I really wanted to know the answer. "Quiet, man. They're back here. Wait a minute and be quiet. They'll come out again," he forcefully whispered. "Who are they?" I whispered back. "The spiders, man. I was asleep when I woke up and they were coming out of my arm." I had known some truly mentally ill people in my life. I'd spent Christmas Eve in a psych ward with my childhood friend who had been in and out of the mental hospital for years with paranoid schizophrenia. And so with Lane and the spiders, I didn't like the look of this or sound of it at all. "Hey, Lane, why don't you get up off the floor and let's go sit on the couch for a minute and talk?" "Shh, quiet, man. They can hear you." My goodness, I thought. He's lost it. I stood there racking my brain as to what my next steps should be. Whatever they were, they would have to be done with utmost care. I thought about calling Jerry Cantrell, but quickly changed my mind. The Alice guys, Jerry, Sean Kinney, and the bass player Mike Inez, along with producer Toby Wright,
had recently enlisted me to try to get Lane out of his apartment and down to a recording studio. They wanted to start making music. Lane would begin by saying, "Tell them I'll be there by 9," and I would relay the message. 9 would turn into 11:30, then 2 a.m., and finally I asked again if he would simply reject the idea out of hand, completely and with a total finality. This routine had gone on for a few days. They would probably be as helpless or more than me in this situation. At least I had a tiny bit of sway with Lane. "Lane, man, listen to me. I don't see any spiders back there. Just get up for a minute and let's go talk quietly in the living room." After several long moments of silence, he suddenly slid backwards on his stomach from behind the toilet bowl, got to his feet, and grabbed me by the arm, leading me into the other room. Lifting his sleeve, he showed me an ugly mark on his arm. "I caught them crawling out of there and saw one peeking out the hole behind the toilet. I have to kill them before they take the whole place over," he said in a choked and extremely quiet voice. He went to put a rock in his crack pipe, a glass tube with cigarette lighter blackened steel wool, stuffed into the end. "Hold on a sec, bro," I said. "Let's not hit the pipe right now. We need to talk about this rationally." It was pure crack craziness that I was witnessing, a frightening level of psychosis. He was convinced there were spiders coming out of his arms, hiding behind his toilet, and taking over his house. I coaxed him to do a shot of dope instead, in hopes it would even out his mind. Then I talked to him into coming over to my place with me, promising I would hire exterminators to go in and clean his place out if he wished. I was pained beyond words to see him in this way, the sweetest, funniest, most magical and intelligent dude I knew out of his tree. Such was my love for the guy. He had become like the half of me I always lacked. After a couple of days, he was back to normal, but occasionally he'd say something that made it clear these imaginary spiders were still somewhere in the back of his mind. I kept him at my house for a week until one day he looked at me and said, "I lost my mind, didn't I?" I looked at him and the familiar mischievous twinkle normally in his eyes was back. I started laughing. "Thank goodness you realized that. I was afraid we were going to have to hit the nut house." "I'm sorry, man," he smiled. "Man, that was weird." "Yeah, it was, but you ain't got nothing to be worried about, brother. I'm just glad you're back," I said to him with great relief. End quote. Unfortunately, as we've been discussing, drugs were very prevalent in the 90s Seattle music scene. Many people, not just Lane, struggled with addiction. I'm going to share with you now another quote from Mark Lanigan's book, Sing Backwards and Weep, involving Demri and also Mike Starr. Mike Starr was the bassist in Alice in Chains until 1993. This story takes place at Mark Lanigan's Seattle apartment in 1995. Quote, "I got buzzed by someone at the front door. To my unhappy surprise, there was Demri, dressed in a white hospital gown, wheeling a pole with an IV bottle at my front door in broad daylight. I was pissed beyond words. What the heck, Demri? What happened to you?" She lowered her gown and showed me the ugly red vertical scar running down the middle of her chest. "I got an illness, and they gave me a pacemaker." She smiled, as if she were telling me she won the lottery. "Mark, do you have any dope? I'll even take cottons, whatever." "Are you kidding me? No way, get yourself back to the hospital, you're out of your mind," I told her. The illness she had was endocarditis, a dreaded illness an IV drug user could catch from the bacteria in heroin. It destroyed your heart valves and was often deadly. That she contracted the infection, had to have a pacemaker installed, and still wheeled herself over here to try to get high, blew my mind. The unforgiving power of her addiction was shocking. I callously shut the door on her mid-sentence during her plea for drugs, turned around, walked back upstairs to my apartment, and turned off the buzzer. Like my first meeting with Demri at the dope house, I kept this episode to myself, not wanting to cause Lane any more heartbreak than he'd already taken. Around the same time, Mike Starr also buzzed me one night. Surprised to see him, I opened the door and let him in. He was the ex-bass player for Alice in Chains. I hadn't seen him in years. "What the heck, Mike? How you been?" Mike replied, "Man, I just got busted but made bail. I'm dope sick as hell. Are you holding anything?" I had not known Mike as a junkie during the time we spent together touring. As far as I was concerned, he was just a strange cat like the trailer park hoodlums I'd grown up with. Not super intelligent, but with a dubious gift for getting over on people. "Sorry to hear that, bro. Come up to my place," I told him. Once inside my apartment, I saw that despite the cold weather, he was dressed in only a white t-shirt and a pair of white boxer shorts. No shoes, nothing. "Sorry, Mike, I don't have any dope. Just a little crack for sale if you're interested." I lied about the dope since I could plainly see he wasn't holding a wallet or any dough. Crack was something I could share a tiny bit of if he were so inclined. Aw, crap, what am I gonna do? He was talking to himself, not me. Mark, can I use your phone? Sure, Mike, go ahead. He got on the phone and went around the corner into my kitchen for some privacy, but in his agitated state, he did not notice me standing right outside the door listening. No, he doesn't have any, he muttered emphatically to whoever was on the other line. He's got crack, that's all I know. No, I don't know if he's got cash up here. Someone had either coerced Mike into trying to burn me, or he was just a scout for whoever came next. He hung up the phone. Hey Mike, sorry I couldn't help you out, but I gotta go somewhere, so you gotta split. Then he asked me, hey, can I catch a ride with you? Sorry man, I'm not riding. I'll see you later, Mike. I opened my infrequently used kitchen door and gently shoved him out, locking the door behind him. For the next 10 minutes or so, he continued knocking intermittently, saying quietly, hey Mark, hey bro, can I come back in? I didn't answer him. Instead, I sat on my couch with a gun. The loaded stolen Desert Eagle 44 Magnum pistol I had traded $50 worth of crack for, just in case there was going to be more to this scene with Mike than met the eye. Eventually, I heard him sigh heavily and the hallway floor creaking as he walked barefoot softly away down the corridor and to the stairs. I would not see him again for several more years.
End quote. Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, and Chris Cornell. Duff McKagan knew all of them. As a matter of fact, one of the last people to ever speak to Kurt Cobain was Duff McKagan. Kurt and Duff sat next to each other on the very last plane Kurt ever took. I'll be sharing a quote from Duff where he discusses this experience momentarily. I'll also be sharing other quotes from Duff McKagan where he talks about Lane Staley and Chris Cornell. Now, although Duff McKagan is known primarily as the bassist of one of the great Los Angeles bands, Guns N' Roses, Duff is actually from Seattle, and before moving to Los Angeles, he played in multiple Seattle bands. Quote, I wanted to be a musician, but the people I was playing with in Seattle, everyone was doing heroin. I wasn't. Heroin decimated so many bands. A friend of mine who was strung out said to me once, man, if you don't get out now, it's gonna pass you by. You're the guy, you're our hope. When I moved to LA, I was living in this cockroach-infested single-room apartment. Los Angeles at the time was Quiet Riot, Rat, and some really terrible bands. In LA, Guns N' Roses was considered punk rock. We were huddled in this corner of Hollywood snapping viciously at any gig we could get. End quote. That quote was from Mark Yarm's book, Everybody Loves Our Town. Now, unfortunately, heroin was a major issue in the grunge scene. I'll be touching on that a bit later, but first, let's get back specifically to Duff and his relationship with Kurt Cobain.
As mentioned, Duff and Kurt were on the same flight from LA to Seattle just a few days before Kurt's death. Duff once recalled that on that flight, him and Kurt were, quote, talking about what it feels like to be going back home. That's what he said he was doing, going home. He seemed happy, but all of my instincts said something was wrong. I didn't have a sense that he was going to die in 2 days, but again, a lot of my friends and peers were dying or had died, and I was getting numb to it, getting used to it. And even when I got the call that he died, I didn't fall out of my chair. It just happened. And I was too messed up to really take it in. I was like, oh, another one fell. End quote.
That was from Greg Prado's book, Grunge is Dead. The following is from Duff McKagan, where he discusses the very last time he ever saw Kurt alive and the Guns N' Roses Nirvana beef. Then I'm going to share with you a quote from Kurt where he discusses his thoughts on the Nirvana Guns N' Roses beef and specifically Kurt's thoughts on Axl Rose. The following quote from Duff McKagan, it's not clear exactly when it's from, but I believe it's from the 2000s. Quote, I was never really friendly with them at the time. I think we tried to get them to open on one of those tours during the Illusion time, and they didn't want to. And then some bad blood started between, well, Axl had some bad blood. I think Axl might have taken it personally and might have said something in the press, although he was a Nirvana fan. And Kurt was a pretty cynical, funny guy. The punk rock humor in Seattle, if you didn't get it, you might get offended. I think Kurt said something at the MTV VMAs in '92. They had their child, Francis Bean, and wanted Axl to be the godfather of the child. And Axl got huffy about it because he thought Kurt was trying to take the piss out of him. It was no big deal. If it was 2 mid-level bands and that happened, nobody would have heard about it. But because the media eye was so tuned into both bands, it got blown out of proportion. And then you can't downplay it. And then it's a war between 2 bands. It's like, oh brother,
I bought a house in Seattle in '92, and I was flying home a couple of years later. Flew out of LAX, and Kurt was sitting an aisle over from me. That's the first time I ever really talked to him. He told me he just left Exodus, was trying to get clean, and didn't know how to. I could relate because I was trying to get clean at the same time. We talked about the stuff we had in common. He seemed bummed. We went to baggage claim together when we got to Seattle. A friend of mine came to get me, and him and Kurt went out to have a smoke. My friend came back in, and I said, maybe you should have him come to my house. He seems bummed out. He went out to get Kurt, but Kurt's car had come and picked him up. End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain regarding Guns N' Roses, particularly the MTV VMA incident. His retelling of the story is a bit different. Quote, there is a war going on in the high schools now between Nirvana kids and Guns N' Roses kids. It's really cool. I'm really proud to be a part of that. I can't think of a dang thing about Guns N' Roses that I like. I can't even waste my time on that band because they're so obviously pathetic and untalented. I used to think that everything in the mainstream pop world was crap, but now that some underground bands have been signed with majors, I now take Guns N' Roses as more of an offense. I have to look into it more. They're really talentless people, and they write crap music, and they're the most popular rock band on the earth right now. I can't believe it. They actually tried to beat us up at the MTV VMAs. Courtney and I were with the baby in the eating area backstage, and Axl walked by. So Courtney yelled, Axl, come over here. We just wanted to say hi to him. We think he's a joke, but we just wanted to say something to him. So I said, will you be the godfather of our child? I don't know what had happened before that to piss him off, but he took his aggressions out on us and began screaming bloody murder. Later, after we played our show and were walking back to our trailer, the Guns N' Roses entourage came walking towards us. They have at least 50 bodyguards apiece. Huge, gigantic guys ready to kill for Axl at all times. They didn't see me, but they surrounded Chris, and Duff McKagan wanted to beat Chris up, and the bodyguards started pushing Chris around. He finally escaped, but throughout the rest of the evening, there was a big threat of either Guns N' Roses themselves or their goons beating us up. We had to hide out. Since then, every time Axl has played a show, he said some comment about me and Courtney. When he was in Seattle, he said, Nirvana would rather stay home and shoot drugs with their wives than tour with us. That's why there's this big feud in most of the high schools. It's hilarious. He is insane though. I was scared. I couldn't possibly beat him up. I know he would beat me up if he had the chance. End quote. The following is from Duff McKagan regarding Soundgarden. This is from Greg Prado's book, Grunge is Dead. Quote, I remember hearing a lot about Soundgarden. They finally came down and played in LA, I want to say in '88. Maybe they played while we were on tour for Appetite, but the first time I saw them was at the Scream in downtown LA. That was a rock band. There weren't many gigs of bands I wanted to see at that point, so when I heard Soundgarden was coming down to play, I went, and I was really hoping that it would still be the Soundgarden I remembered and heard such great things about. And they just blew my mind. For some reason, I always look at the drummer. If the drummer is good, the rest will follow. And Matt was just insane, playing all those different meters. And Kim Thayil, wow, what is that? And Cornell's voice was Robert Plant on acid. They were menacing, beautiful, musical, the whole thing. End quote. Alice in Chains and Duff McKagan have a long history together. Duff saw firsthand how heroin impacted many of the people in that world, including Lane Staley. Lane Staley, of course, died on April 5th of 2002 in his apartment in Seattle. It's well documented that during the last years of Lane's life, he lived in almost total isolation within that apartment, rarely letting anybody inside at all. According to Duff McKagan, he and Mark Lanigan once tried to visit Lane during these last years at his apartment to talk to him. Quote, the apartment he had was not far from my house in Seattle. He lived probably 12 blocks away. Back in 2001 or so, Mark Lanigan and I were going to go up to his apartment and try to talk to him. I think Mark tried and wanted me to go up. I didn't though. It wouldn't have done any good. End quote. Sadly, Lane Staley and Mark Lanigan aren't the only tragic grunge singers Duff McKagan had ties to. Duff McKagan, famously, is also one of the last people to have had a conversation with Kurt Cobain before his death. Duff McKagan and Kurt Cobain just so happened to be on the same airplane going from Los Angeles to Seattle. More on that later. Going back to Lane Staley for now, when Alice in Chains eventually reformed after his death, there were some people who felt the band shouldn't continue under the same name. As for some people, there is no Alice in Chains without Lane Staley. Duff McKagan, however, has always been a big supporter of the post-Lane Staley era Alice in Chains. Prior to the release of Alice in Chains' third post-Lane Staley album, Rainier Fog, Duff McKagan made the following statement, quote, "To watch Jerry Cantrell, Sean Kinney, and Mike Inez gather themselves along with the brilliant William Duvall was, to me, like watching Rocky in 1976 as a 12-year-old. The underdog who put in all the hard work and experienced all the hard knocks and hidden trapdoors life could throw at you, yet rose to fight back with elegance and power. Only they knew what they had at first, but with the release of '09's comeback record Black Gives Way to Blue debuting at number 5 on the Billboard 200, and spawning 2 #1 singles and 2 Grammy nominations, the band remained at the very top of their game. The whole rock and roll world seemed to rejoice at once. This was our Rocky story." End quote. Now, as mentioned, Duff McKagan is from Seattle and witnessed much of the heroin problems facing the music scene and the city in general firsthand. The following is a quote from Duff McKagan where he discusses the subject. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Sometime in 1982, as the music scene became bigger and a recession hit Seattle, we all noticed a huge influx of heroin and pills. Addiction suddenly skyrocketed within my circle of friends, and death by overdose became almost commonplace. I witnessed my first overdose when I was 18. I saw the love of my life wither away because of smack, and one of my best friends imploded because of it. By the time I was 23, 2 of my best friends had died from heroin. In Seattle, heroin was fast becoming a staple in pretty much everyone's diet, not just musicians. Up until 1982, I had heard about heroin, but rarely saw it. Then suddenly, I began to see a lot of older kids starting to use heroin openly. As more and more of my contemporaries lost their jobs, smack spread quickly. It would be everywhere by 1983. I didn't plan on leaving Seattle. What happened in Seattle in the early 80s, recession hit Seattle especially hard. There was no Microsoft, there was just Boeing. Boeing was going through some problems in the 70s. They were threatening closing down, and there were billboards around Seattle. Would the last person who leaves Seattle please turn the light out? Basically, Seattle was going to shut down. And it almost did in the early 80s. You'd go downtown and I swear it would be like newspapers blowing down the street. Pretty desolate. And heroin started to creep its way into the scene. It became epidemic by 83. There was pretty much no place to play except for rented rehearsal places. If you were 21 and over, I guess there was, but it wasn't supported by the punk rock scene because everybody was underage. That's when I bailed, in August of 84. In general, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of heroin around. There were a lot of drugs and alcohol infiltrated into bands. Guns N' Roses had nothing in common with most of the bands of our time, and I think probably the same is true with Nirvana. Even with bands from Seattle like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, they were alienated in drugs and uber success. Guns was a band that did stuff on their own terms, and so did Nirvana. There was probably an awful lot more in common than dis in common. I never saw it as any different. The press certainly made a lot out of it then, and still does." End quote.
In my opinion, the most tragic situation from the Seattle scene involving heroin was the death of Lane Staley. I've made a few videos about that subject on this channel.
The following is from ex-Alice in Chains manager Susan Silver on Lane Staley's drug addiction. This is from Grunge is Dead. Quote, "The Dirt record, the making of that record, started to be compromised. It took longer periods of time to get things done. It started to be undeniable. After Andy Wood died, there's this denial factor. And I was already deep in a struggle with my own brother, who was also a heroin addict. For me, this couldn't happen to someone else who hasn't gone down that road already, because they'll see this is where it leads. So I had a certain amount of denial that it was a problem with Lane in the beginning. And then it just became my life as the Dirt cycle unfolded. I spent more hours every single day focused on and dealing with heroin addiction than I did managing my client's career. It became a behemoth. I lost my brother to the battle, so it was all-consuming. It was a horror show so much of the time, which ultimately led to nothing except pure trauma on my part to see my own husband go down that road so many years later. It was shocking. By the beginning of the tour cycle with Dirt, it was something that I was dealing with every day. And through that cycle, there were many cancellations and incidences. But Lane never gave up hope. He was not a sneaky drug addict. He was open about his struggle. He tried so hard on numerous occasions to get clean, through rehabs, and was willing to talk with people about it. He was willing to talk to the press about it. He was really honest about it, often apologetic about it. It kept taking him down. The thing about Soundgarden and Alice, they had really clear musical direction within the group. What an outside producer or A&R person had to say about the music was irrelevant. It really just bounced off. In a sense, there wasn't any pressure from the outside like that. Internally, everyone had a pretty strong agreement as to what they liked. They were making some amazing music. Of course, however, by that time, a big part of Alice in Chains' focus and struggle was drug addiction. The Dog record in particular in 1995 really was painful putting together. It took 8 or 9 months, hours and hours of waiting for Lane to come out of the bathroom, days of waiting for him to show up at the studio. And through all those last years, he and I were really close. I kept telling him, you don't have to do this. You have enough money to go and have a quiet life if that's what you want, with his longtime girlfriend Demri. Just go and do what makes you happy. Don't do this if this is what's perpetuating your addiction. I didn't understand that it wasn't the music that was making him take his drugs. He had a disease, and it was getting worse. But I was always saying, what do you want to do? We can stop. He'd say, I want to keep going. In terms of music, I'm not talking about drugs. He wanted to keep creating and recording. It was a really painful session because it took so long. It was so horrifying to see him in that condition. Yet, when he was cognizant, he was the sweetest, bright-eyed guy you'd ever want to meet. To be in a meeting with him and have him fall asleep in front of you was gut-wrenching. As the timeline will show, we stopped. We stopped many times to say, this isn't going to work. We can't keep doing this. Even if he says he wants to. It's just tearing everybody to shreds. He wouldn't answer the phone, wouldn't answer the door. Every once in a while, he'd let one guy in that had been friends with the Alice guys who ultimately worked in my office. I was one of the only people he would let in to see him and bring him things from the office. He was very much housebound. He came out for a recording session, and that was the last time I saw him. The session was supposed to be at 4 in the afternoon. He finally got there at midnight. And that's just the way it was with Lane. You go to pick him up to take him somewhere, and the next thing you know, 4 hours have gone by. He could pull you into the world, shuffling around, getting somewhere over here, and then getting somewhere over there, doing something on the Game Boy, and then doing something on the TV. Days would go by. He came to that session. I hadn't seen him maybe since I went to his apartment in 1996 to tell him that his girlfriend died. I hardly recognized him. He looked different. He didn't look like himself anymore. But he had the same sparkling wit. Looking at him thinking, my goodness, he's physically changed, yet just as sweet, just as funny. Quoting lines from silly Nickelodeon at night TV shows. The news of his death was a phone call we all feared for years. No one had heard from him. And the people that we were in touch with to let us know that he was still okay hadn't heard from him. His little odd weekly habits had stopped. Sean got a call from one of those people and said, I'm going over there and I'm going to kick the door. I have this sick feeling in my gut. I said, Sean, we need to get his family involved. His stepdad and his mom. When he didn't answer the door or respond in any way, the police opened the door, and the rest is history.
End quote. The following is a quote from Art Chantry,
a graphic designer who was involved in the Seattle grunge movement. In this quote, he discusses Kurt Cobain's drug addiction and in particular the fact that having money actually made the situation much worse. This quote is from the book Grunge is Dead. Quote, I don't know if you've ever had to deal with junkies before, particularly ones that have money. Walls are built around them. It's like the people that are on the inside protect their junkie, especially if the junkie has the earning power of a Kurt Cobain. What you end up with are layers of, it's like concrete circles. That's why that Nirvana t-shirt with the diagram of layers of redemption was so perfect, because that's the way the structure of the Nirvana camp worked. It was very, very difficult for outsiders to work their way through the various layers to get at people that could actually make decisions. It was all designed as protection. And it was true of any junkie. That's the way junkies operate their lives. That's the way the Alice in Chains camp worked. That's the way Lanigan worked. Nobody got inside the Nirvana camp. It was like a compound. It was even hard for the other band members to get through the layers sometimes. It's like heroin defined the scene. Seattle's always been a heroin town. It's a port city. Portland's always been a heroin town. But, like all culture explosions since World War II,
When the German high command started to use methamphetamines, every major cultural scene in Western civilization, and we're talking bikers, beatniks, hippies, glam rock, punk, funk, Warhol Factor, the surfers, hot riders, trucks, were all speed freaks. It had a huge impact on our culture. And in Seattle in the early days, it was no different. Crystal meth was the drug of choice. For the longest time, cheap crystal meth was where it was at in this town. There were a few people who took heroin, but usually it's because they got exposed to it in other cities. It wasn't until the money rolled in, and this is true of every cultural explosion you see in these towns, it's followed by heroin. And there's a heroin epidemic. Heroin follows the money. This is the way things always work. Seattle fell right into it. Like any punk scene, it's amazing how many people die. You get all this money, and a lot of these guys, especially if they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they can't handle it, and it kills them. Usually through self-indulgence, not being able to spend their money right. Rich junkies are as good as dead. Rich junkies don't live.
End quote. As Art Chantry stated, there were different cliques of people within Nirvana handling different things, such as getting Kurt drugs. Craig Montgomery, one of Nirvana's recording engineers, touched on this subject in an interview with Jillian G. Garr. Quote,
"There was Kurt and Courtney and the people in charge of getting them everywhere, and then everybody else. There was a real dichotomy. Their drug problems were bad, and they were worried about how they were going to get drugs. They're pretty much sick because they can't get their drugs, and then you go to Japan where it's even harder. He was just a shell in Japan. Courtney was having health problems. Kurt was having health and drug problems too. I wasn't directly privy to it. I tried to keep my head down and do sound, and hopefully not have anybody get pissed at me. It would be stressful because there were times that we didn't know if we were going to make the show or not. Kurt's in the hotel room throwing up, or he's worried about his voice. His voice was always a problem. He was not a healthy guy. Every show we got through was a relief."
End quote. As Art Chantry stated earlier, drug addicts with money who can get drugs whenever they please are in big trouble. Fame was always a double-edged sword for Kurt. With the fame came money, and with the money came more drugs. Kurt's fame scared his Aunt Mary. It's well documented that Aunt Mary was the family member Kurt Cobain was closest with. In this quote I'm going to share with you, she says that seeing Kurt on MTV for the first time scared her, because in her own words, Kurt was not the most stable person. I believe this quote from Aunt Mary is from an interview she did with journalist Jillian G. Garr.
Quote, "When I first saw him on MTV, I cried. Because it was like, this is too much. It was just like, wow. To know somebody that makes it big like that is a really very strange feeling. Because you feel like what I felt for him was fear for him. I don't know what it was. It was all these mixed emotions. I felt happy for him. I felt afraid for him. Just a lot of different things. Because I knew that he wasn't the most stable person in the world. But it wasn't like I consciously thought of that. I was just really excited for him and very happy for him in the beginning. But it was quite a lot for him. I really think music was for Kurt as it was for me at one time, an escape. It was an understanding friend, predictable and comforting. When he became famous, music was no longer an escape for him. It was a nightmare of scheduled creativity and harried performances. It was almost as if he became a caricature of himself and the whole grunge movement. Kurt's success only reinforced my suspicion of how the music business operates. By that, I mean the artist becomes a commodity, a can of beans, if you will, merely a saleable product. Can anything drain the human spirit more?"
End quote. Now, going back to Mark Lanigan. When it comes to Kurt Cobain and Mark Lanigan's relationship, and in a broader sense, the relationship between Nirvana and the Screaming Trees, there were a lot of different ways in which the two bands were connected.
One of those connections is producer Steve Fisk, who worked with both Nirvana and the Screaming Trees. I've done a couple of interviews with Steve over the years. The first one was about Nirvana, and the second was about the Trees. I want to show you a clip now from my interview with Steve about the Screaming Trees, where he touches on Mark Lanigan. Later in this video, I'll be exploring more details about Mark Lanigan's relationship with Kurt Cobain, including a quote from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickrell, where, according to Mark, Kurt Cobain was actually intimidated by Mark Lanigan, at least initially. I'll be exploring that and more later on. But first, the Steve Fisk clip. If you want to see the full interview with Steve, the link is available below. So what was it like working with Mark Lanigan as a vocalist?
Well, I think the longer he sang, the more he figured out what he could do with that bass register, that low tenor thing. That's kind of his signature now.
Did you ever double his voice?
A lot of the time, yeah. He chewed tobacco.
As he was singing?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. It was always hard to make his voice read against all those guitar overdubs. Mark learned the hard way that if you leave Lee on his own, he'll just do guitar overdubs. By the time we got to mixing the Invisible Lantern record, Mark was like, what? Like, no. You know?
That's funny.
He was at home in his low octave, which hadn't really blossomed yet. Mark Lanigan, as we know him now, you can start to hear, you know, that thing kind of jump out where the screams all land, you know. And when he goes for a big note, he's got the right lyric and the right turn and the right push behind it. There was a couple of moments where I went like, oh shit, you know, he's really turning into something really wonderful, you know. And he was always good, and he was always lyric and melodic. If he wasn't happy, then the whole vibe got just, you know, then there was no vibe, and you were just trying to make Mark happy. But Mark was also in a lot of physical pain, and he had really bad headaches, and he was totally sober the whole time, you know. It's none of my fucking business, but you know, when you're making a complete, you know, commitment to doing psychedelic records, I was the only guy that smoked pot. Nobody smoked pot. You know, a couple of guys in the band drank a little bit, but you know, Mark was serious about doing it. I mean, he, you know, and we went through a kind of a sound search on his voice and played with different kinds of compression and turning off compression. So no, there was a whole very concerted effort. We started with this Neumann because it was the best, that KM84 I was telling you about earlier. I think that's the vocal mic on Other Worlds and Clairvoyance, and eventually we switched over to an SM58, which is kind of a pedestrian microphone, but it's a great microphone to scream into. I know you had a whole video about Kurt Cobain screaming in microphones and all of that. But, you know, Mudhoney, we're using SM58s. Everybody's using SM58s, so we just quit fucking around with trying to do something high quality or fancy and just use an SM58. So, yeah, Invisible Lantern and even if and especially when we're just, you know, Mark singing into a mic on a stand. One of the other things you got to think about too is when you have an 8-track, that means at a certain point you have to erase the scratch vocal. There's no way to save the scratch vocal. And even though the sound was shitty and there was tons of bleed, Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals were so good. And I would try to talk him out of it, but there wasn't like any fancy digital thing where you could bounce it off someplace with the idea that, you know, eventually you'd figure out some way to use it or something like that. And it didn't sound anything like a real vocal because it had guitars and cymbals and everything in it. But Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals, he delivered on every fucking take. There wasn't a scratch vocal that wasn't as good as it could get. As somebody who later really learned how to recognize a good take, the idea that there aren't any live Mark Lanigan takes from that whole period of our work with him, I'm just embarrassed. You know, that's just stupid. You know, but that's just the reality of it. And then it's also, that's working with an artist and understanding is like, there's no way I'm putting that vocal out, you know.
No, I hear you. So I mean,
erase it, you know?
So would he be the kind of person that he would sing like 15, 20 minutes, take a break and come back? Or would he be one of the guys that would go for like 2 hours straight? Like what was he like in that regard?
I think we had evenings where we just sang vocals, you know, 4 hours of singing, 3 hours of singing. It was just like at a certain point, there was just sort of a workman, you know, thing. We're like, all right, you know, we've done all the guitars, let's do all the vocals. I didn't know anything about different kinds of singers. I hadn't learned fuck, you know, so I learned a lot about recording vocals working with Lanigan, and I think we tried all kinds of things, you know. Remember there was one song, I forgot which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was an Invisible Lantern song where Mark didn't want to finish it or didn't want to finish writing the words or something. Forget what the thing was, and he made it like a whole party out of it where it says, okay, Rod Doak, you know, the same thing, you go sing it now. Okay, Lee, you sing it now. And Lee would go out and do his version of it, and we make a mix of that. And it says, okay, Fisk, you go out and sing it now. So there's this one song that's got And there's this cassette of it somewhere. Maybe it's gone by now, but it's just me doing all these rough mixes of like these, and everybody in the studio sang the song because Mark was just having fun, kind of not finishing the vocal.
That's funny.
You know?
So in general, like how many takes would you get for his vocals? Like would you do a lot of takes or just not that many?
It seemed to go well. He was never like, hey, I just nailed that. You know, he's not that kind of guy. So even when it was great, he still had all kinds of misgivings, but he could walk away from it going, that's as good as it's going to get tonight. Neither of us knew what we were doing. You know, we figured out in SM58, and I think there was an old Symmetrix 522 compressor. He just did a great job of figuring out his shit. And it was by, you know, a lot of learn by, you know, by doing kind of thing, you know. So a lot of shit was good enough, but, you know, for him, you know, he's got a kind of a relentless thing about perfection and all of that. So I think that drove him to, you know, do all this other, you know, God, it's really inaccurate, really, really badly worded. But, you know, what he turned into was because he wasn't happy with what he was. And without getting into the book, but the idea that he was saddled with doing this kind of genre music, you know, the psychedelic thing, you know, it's like he loved it, he dug it, but like all the Screaming Trees, he listened to tons of music. So the idea that he doesn't want to talk about, you know, the old stuff or play the old songs or anything like that, I mean, that makes complete sense. You know, it was where he landed, it's how he got started, but, you know, I don't think it was his first love.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in a small town, you know, there's not another band, you know, so I think, you know, he loved all these guys, but, you know, it wasn't necessarily, you know, a good fit from the beginning, you know. And then you go to Seattle, and then you're in the goddamn 90s, you know, and you're from Eastern Washington, so you're not part of, you know, the UW hipster thing or the North End metal thing or any of this shit. So they're outsiders in the middle of this thing that's incredibly political and high pressure and weird, and surprised they got to be friends with Nirvana. Also the Hicks from the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You know?
Maybe that's why they connected, you know?
Yeah.
The following is from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel, where he discusses Kurt Cobain's admiration for Screaming Trees singer Mark Lanigan. Quote, "They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums for a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but really be the band leader. He just is a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Chris. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanigan's talents and vision." End quote. This supergroup that Mark Pickerel is referring to, of course, would be known as the Jury. On August 20th and 28th, 1989, the band recorded 4 tracks with producer Jack Endino, including a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Later in this video, I'm going to show you a clip from one of my interviews with Jack Endino where he reflects on this, but first I'm going to share with you a quote from Mark Pickerel where he discusses how the project came together. Quote, "We were all becoming big blues fans during a similar point in time. I think Lanigan approached me with it because he knew that I was already a big Leadbelly fan, and just a blues fan in general. And since Kurt and Chris were both becoming fans of the same genre, we thought it'd be cool to be the first band out of the Northwest that already had some notoriety to try and forge ahead with a different sound, or a different vision. I believe we learned a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night from a cassette that I had. I think Kurt brought a cassette version of Ain't It a Shame. Grey Goose may have been Lanigan. I think we started exclusively with Leadbelly, and then we were going to branch out from there. The original idea was just to do a session devoted to Leadbelly, and then go back in later on and do some other blues artists as well. Mark's vocals with Kurt's vocals could have led to something really powerful, I think, but the irony is, it was that combination of those two personalities that slowed things down. They were like junior high kids at a dance, a couple of wallflowers. I felt like I was the cheerleader of the entire session, always making suggestions and trying to get us to move in a certain direction. or to try a certain song, or even sometimes suggesting who might sing the song. Neither Mark or Kurt really wanted to take the initiative to make a lot of decisions. It's funny now that everyone's calling the project the jury, because no one else seemed to be all that excited about the idea at the time. Kurt really wanted to call it Lithium. It seemed as though Mark was satisfied with the name, but not necessarily excited about it. And I don't remember if Chris had an opinion one way or the other about it. But Kurt definitely did not want to call it the jury. And the funny thing is, I don't really care for that name anymore. But it's a little too late for that. Who knows what we might have done if we'd been able to get together once a year for a couple of weeks. Lanigan and I have massive record collections, so there would have been a wealth of music for us to listen to learn from, research, and recreate. I really regret that it didn't happen." End quote. Here's the Jack and Dino clip, guys. If you'd like to see the full interview with Jack and Dino, the link is available below. You know, when people think of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, they often think of the MTV Unplugged version. But you actually recorded, from what I understand, the original one that Mark Lanigan and Kurt Cobain did together. Is this correct?
Correct.
And what was the story there exactly?
I may get this wrong because nobody has asked me about this for a long time. At some point, there was a session where Mark Lanigan and Mark Pickrell, the drummer from the Screaming Trees, and Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were going to come in and record a side project that they'd been doing where they supposedly were writing some songs together. Now, they booked the time, and then apparently they never wrote any songs together, or as Kurt said, well, we wrote some songs together, but we forgot them all. I don't know if it ever happened, actually. Mm-hmm. But he said, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to record some Lead Belly tunes. And I thought, okay. So they came in and recorded, and I think this is when that session took place. They recorded Where Did You Sleep Last Night? They recorded Ain't It a Shame, which is on the box set, and something called Grey Goose, which I had no memory of for years and years because it doesn't have a vocal. It's literally one riff over and over again. It's not very exciting, but there it was on the master tapes when we finally pulled it out. They just, for some reason, nobody bothered singing on it that day. And it ended up on the box set, I think. That was all they managed to do that day. One song with Mark singing, one song with Kurt singing, and an instrumental. And I asked them, what do I put on the log sheet? And they said, I'll call it the jury. I said, okay. So, but it wasn't really a band. But it was the only time I got to record Mark Pickrell drumming with Chris and Kurt. And I think that is where that version of Where Do You Sleep Last Night came from. Because sometime after that, when I was recording Mark Lanigan's first solo record, I think the subject of that song came up and we decided to just put that on the end of it. That's why that song is on the winding sheet. There's another song on the winding sheet called Down in the Dark, where we got Kurt to come in and do a backing vocal, and I'm doing a little electric guitar on it as well. Probably the only thing on which I'm playing guitar with Kurt singing that exists, which is interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Yes, but that was the version, that arrangement of the song, I think, is what inspired Kurt to do the song at the Unplugged session much later.
Really?
Probably so. Although really, Kurt was present when we recorded the Mark Lanigan version, so, I'm sure they arranged it together. Anyway, this is all speculation.
So for you, when you listen to, I guess, the Unplugged version, how does it compared to the versions that you were involved with? Like, what do you think of it?
The arrangement is the same. The difference really is the instrumentation and the vocal. He sings it very similar to how Mark Lanigan sings it, but, he puts the sort of Kurt passion into it, really.
Yeah.
Different players, different instrumentation. I think the only thing in common is, Kurt's playing acoustic on it,